Yeah, for sure. Okay, very good.
Says what you want from the federal government.
Okay,
Right?
very
I think
good.
that's kind of
Because
you don't want to be funny.
Tu sais, là, le sort de la nation en dépend pas de ta barouette. C'est sûr que vous le savez déjà. Tu sais, il faut sortir des pronoms, des carottes, puis ce que tu veux. Là.
It can only
Tout
benefit.
le monde le sait depuis longtemps. Mais
we have to get out of
Yeah, do you want to stand here? I'll go. I'll move.
No, I can move when they start. Then I have to stand.
I don't want.
Leave. No, then you're gonna leave.
Thank you, everyone. Premier Moe will have an opening statement followed by Premier Legault. Premier Moe.
Well, thank you very much, and I would like, oh, pardon me. There's a joke about that somewhere in here. I do want to begin by thanking my fellow premiers for joining me at this meeting of the Council of Federation, and in particular, I want to thank the gentleman seated to my right, Premier Doug Ford, for hosting us here in Toronto, Ontario. Thank you so much, Doug. This meeting came together at the request of a number of my colleagues following the divisive results that manifested themselves in the federal election. And in my meeting with the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago, we discussed the role of myself as Chair of COF and the opportunity that we may have to find consensus with my colleagues at this table from coast to coast to coast on critical issues such as improvements to our environmental assessments and federal transfers across this nation, as well as the federal transfer that would include fiscal stabilization. The Council of Federation table was built on the principle of consensus, a place where premiers can come together and put aside our differences and work together on behalf of not just the people we represent in our respective jurisdictions, but work together on behalf of all Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And I think it's fair to say that there's been questions in the past around this table being able to focus in and then actually agree on some of those priorities. And I think you can see today that this most certainly, this agreement on a number of priorities has been achieved. The communique outlines consensus on critical priorities for our provinces, and the four main areas of that consensus are: first, with respect to economic competitiveness. And our premiers are committed to strengthening Canada's economy to increase the competitiveness and create jobs in each and every region of this nation. This includes ensuring that environmental assessments, the process around environmental assessments provides regulatory certainty and exempts projects that fall within provincial and territorial jurisdiction. Number two would be fiscal stabilization, and premiers agreed that the consideration must be given to restructuring the fiscal stabilization formula to better address the current inequities that exist and the failures of the program to be responsive to the changing economic needs of provinces, most recently including Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Alberta. Healthcare and infrastructure. Premiers agreed that the federal transfer in areas such as infrastructure and healthcare should respect the diverse priorities of each province and territory and reflect the flexibility that is necessary to allow provinces and territories to address their regional priorities. And last, but certainly not least, is our northern priorities and our commitment to the north, with a focus on nation-building activities that are needed in the three territories, including robust investment in infrastructure to improve the lives of Northerners and providing a greater action to address climate change. The Council of Federation will be communicating these priorities to the Prime Minister as our key points of discussion for the upcoming First Ministers' meeting. The provinces have shown that we can unite and work together to come to consensus, if you will, on these critical issues, and I respectfully would ask that our Prime Minister and the federal government now work with the leaders at this table. Lastly, on a very personal note, as the Premier of Saskatchewan, I want to thank each and every one of my fellow premiers for recognizing and addressing the economic disparity that has arisen in distinct regions of our nation, namely Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Newfoundland. They were unwavering in their support to recommended changes to the fiscal stabilization program, and I would say that today they had our backs, and I commit to them that we will have theirs when needed as well. We recognize that as Canadians first, we must look past our own regional interests and support the priorities of each of our provinces, from coast to coast to coast. Now I'll turn it over to Premier Legault.
Oui, merci Scott. À mon tour de dire ma satisfaction de voir qu'on a réussi, tous les premiers ministres des provinces et des territoires, à s'entendre sur 4 priorités en vue d'une rencontre avec le premier ministre du Canada au début de l'année 2020, qui sera donc gérée de façon conjointe avec les premiers ministres des provinces et le premier ministre du Canada, puis qui portera sur les 4 priorités sur lesquelles on s'est tous entendus depuis hier. Ces 4 priorités, bien, la première, travailler sur la compétitivité de notre économie. Plusieurs points. D'abord, s'assurer que les projets soient acceptés, évalués plus rapidement avec une seule évaluation environnementale qui serait sous la responsabilité des provinces, donc éviter les dédoublements du côté du gouvernement fédéral. On souhaite aussi que le gouvernement fédéral travaille avec nous à avoir moins de mesures protectionnistes avec les États-Unis, entre autres le Buy America Act, qui nous empêche actuellement de proposer nos produits à cause des exigences très élevées en contenu local, jusqu'à 70 %. Deuxième priorité, comme le disait Scott, tous les premiers ministres ont accepté que l'Alberta, la Saskatchewan et Terre-Neuve-Labrador vivaient une situation spéciale, difficile, avec la baisse très rapide des revenus reliés aux ressources. Donc, ensemble, on demande tous au gouvernement fédéral d'améliorer le programme fiscal de stabilisation pour mieux aider ces provinces. Troisième demande, on demande à M. Trudeau de respecter les priorités des provinces, entre autres dans le domaine de la santé, donc être capable plutôt d'augmenter le transfert fédéral en santé de 5,2 %. Et s'il y a des nouveaux programmes, comme dans le domaine de l'assurance médicaments, bien, qu'il y ait une clause de droit de retrait avec pleine compensation pour les provinces. Du côté des infrastructures, on demande au gouvernement fédéral, encore là, de respecter les priorités de chaque province et de s'assurer aussi de réduire les délais d'autorisation de ces projets importants. Dernière priorité, les priorités nordiques. On s'est tous mis d'accord pour dire que dans les 3 territoires, il y a des efforts spéciaux à faire sur les infrastructures pour améliorer la qualité de vie des citoyens dans les régions nordiques. Donc, encore une fois, on demande à M. Trudeau qu'on puisse travailler tous ensemble, quelque part au début de l'année 2020, pour faire avancer ces 4 priorités sur lesquelles toutes les provinces et territoires s'entendent.
Thanks very much, everyone. We'll take questions from mic number 1, Joyce.
Good afternoon, Premiers. Joyce Napier, CTV. Thank you for taking our questions. I want to ask you about health care. You want an increase of 5.2%. Some of you have spoken to the Prime Minister. Certainly you have mentioned that to him. What was his reaction, and what do you think Ottawa will say to that request?
Well, I can go. I did speak to the Prime Minister about healthcare, of course, and you know the message that we send to Canadians today, that this is a top priority no matter which province you live in. I think Canadians want to see the federal government more involved in the delivery of healthcare. Joyce, as you've mentioned, I also raised the issue of Pharmacare, but other premiers might feel the need to opt out of a program. What I know is that we have Canadians in my province, we have Canadians that tell me that every single province are having difficulty today making choices around the medications they have to buy, making the decision around food, heat, and so on. So anytime we get an opportunity to expand Pharmacare into places like Newfoundland and Labrador, these are discussions that I want to have, recognizing too that I want to see the federal government more involved in health care across our country. And before I conclude, I want to thank Scott for chairing this event today, and I also want to thank Doug for hosting this event. But there's one other person I want to mention at this table today who brought a lot of insight, and that was great to see Premier Cochrane back at the table from the Northwest Territories. It's really great to see a strong woman at a Premier's table again, so welcome, Premier Cochrane.
Can I go?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ellen.
Yeah, I'll take that one if I could, and just add that we all know that we have a #1 priority in Canada among Canadians, and that is health care. And we also know, according to the Canadian Institute of Health Information, that wait times in virtually every category have grown over the past 3 years as this incremental strategy is failing Canadians. And as those wait times grow, that burden on Canadians is real. So we want to see a sustainable partnership with the federal government on healthcare because we consider it to be of critical importance to the social fabric of the country. To sustain healthcare, we need that partnership, and we also need an economy that grows and functions to provide the tax revenues to support it on an ongoing basis. And that's the other area I'm sure others will have questions about here.
Next question.
I'll weigh in on that as well. I believe, and I think all of us at this table believe that a fundamental component of our Canadian citizenship is universal access to quality public health care. And that's been eroding over decades now. And it was an opportunity coming together to address fiscal federalism, to address how we work together cooperatively from coast to coast to coast. The foundation of that cooperation has to be a robust economy, so we addressed that. It had to be focused on the issues that matter to people. People care about health care. They care about their schools, their hospitals, their infrastructure. In the north, critically important, the Premier's made it abundantly clear that when we talk about infrastructure in the south, we have no idea of the challenges of vast distances, small populations, and inadequate infrastructure. So we talked about nation building today, all of us, and it was an extraordinary meeting, but it was we're in an extraordinary time. 4 of us sit before you as leaders of minority governments. We look to Ottawa where there's a minority government. I find, and I think my colleagues in the minority situations would agree, that this is a unique opportunity for us to work together, regardless of where we live in the country, regardless of how we vote. The passion of Canadians is directed at us succeeding. Jason and Alberta need to succeed just as much as Blaine and New Brunswick, and that's what brought us together. And I want to thank Doug for hosting us. The Maple Leaf jersey will be difficult. I've already seen an explosion on Twitter about that. I want the record to show I didn't put it on, and I'll move on.
About fiscal stabilization, you said that you want a restructuring of it. Would that put aside your differences on equalization?
Well, first of all, let me thank my colleagues here for showing that they understand the adversity Albertans are going through and folks in other parts of the country like Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador. This was a tremendous moment of solidarity. I've been trying to convey to Albertans that we are not alone or isolated in the Federation, that there are provincial and territorial governments who get what we're going through and who understand our ask for a fair deal in the Canadian Federation. And this language on reforming the fiscal stabilization program is a key element of our ask for fairness, as is the #1 priority in the communique around economic competitiveness, specifically developing our resources and getting them to global markets, as well as asking the federal government to work with us on fixing problems in their environmental assessment regime, which is now basically the Bill C-69, the new Environmental Impact Act, and expanding international trade to get our resources and products to markets. These are essential points. For Albertans who have played an oversized role in the Canadian Federation, we are proud to have contributed $600 billion net to the rest of the Federation since 1960, and even during some really tough years where a lot of our people are out of work, losing their homes, that we have seen Albertans contributing net $20 billion a year plus to the rest of the country. So all we've asked for as an initial step is to lift this cap on the fiscal stabilization program. It basically gives us a little bit back of what we put into the Federation every year. And we will put that money, if the federal government follows through and listens to this unanimous recommendation from Canada's premiers, we'll put those funds, which we paid into the federal system, to work with job creation programs in Alberta. So I'm just delighted. Now, we will continue to have, Alberta will continue to press for reforms to the equalization program. We weren't going to get into, in a 3-hour meeting today, an extraordinary meeting, into a top-to-bottom rewrite of fiscal federalism, including equalization. We believe the equalization system should be more fair. And we'll get into that. I'm happy to get into that. In fact, some of my colleagues have said we need a larger conversation about fiscal federalism. Bottom line is, I am truly grateful on behalf of the people of Alberta for the recognition. You know, every premier here, every province and territory has unique priorities and pressures, and we all could have added dozens of different points into this communique. But the fact that these colleagues have put a spotlight on one particular issue that means a lot to those of us going through periods of prolonged downturns, I think means a great deal to Albertans, and I just want to say thank you.
I would reiterate that in my opening comments. I had mentioned that as well. This is a very, very focused communique coming out of an unprecedented meeting, and this is by no means for us to sit up here and say that we agree on absolutely everything. We have much work to do across our provinces, but today what you have seen in an unprecedented fashion is premiers from across the nation, from coast to coast to coast in this nation, coming together to address some significant challenges that are present in many of our jurisdictions, but disproportionately affecting a few jurisdictions here, and addressing that in the agreements on not only the removal of the cap, but the willingness to look at some of the thresholds with respect to the fiscal stabilization program, and we put that forward before the Prime Minister to have and the federal finance minister to have a look at just such parameters, as well as an agreement that we need to work together to come to a better place to provide certainty for not only our industries that are investing in this nation when it comes to the Environmental Impact Act, but also provide certainty for, in many cases, investments that are being made by governments in the way of public safety, in the way of flood control in the case of Manitoba. So this is an unprecedented meeting where I also would like to take the opportunity to thank each of my colleagues for putting our differences aside, focusing in on some of the immediate challenges that we have in certain areas of this nation, and the people of Saskatchewan can be very appreciative of your efforts here today.
Thank you.
So if I could, for a minute or two, I think most Canadians, they could talk to you about equalization. Most people would say that it's an unfair distribution of funds amongst certain provinces. And I agree today and echo some of the comments that we've seen here, that there's been tremendous leadership that has been supplied by the recipients of equalization for provinces that are in that need help. But to put that in context, in 2016, I represent a province, Newfoundland and Labrador, that had lost $1.1 billion in revenue from oil royalties. That was on a budget of just over $7 billion. Not many people would know what the Stabilization Fund was all about. I'll tell you what it was about for Newfoundland and Labrador. It was $7.9 million. Steering down a $1.1 billion loss in revenue, this fund would have provided Newfoundland and Labrador $7.9 million. So insignificant. So when you use the word stabilization fund, you think the intent would be to stabilize something. Well, it didn't work. It's outdated. It's been around since the 80s. Thankfully for the premiers and the support that we have at this table today, working with the federal government, we will get a fund that's flexible, responsive, and relevant to the needs of provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, like Alberta, and like Saskatchewan, but also for some other province in the future that might find itself in a similar situation.
Next question, mic number 2.
Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. Earlier today, Mr. Pallister was telling us that maybe Pharmacare is not a priority, considering that waiting times are getting longer and longer in the healthcare system. So I'd like to hear from each and every one of you. Would you like to establish a Pharmacare program in your province, and at what conditions?
Well, since you're referencing my comments, I'll just offer this clarification. If you can't sustain health care and all the multitude of services that we offer effectively, then you will have lineups grow as they have grown over the last number of years right across the country in every category. So what we're after here is a sustained relationship that can sustain health care. If you can't get that right, don't start with another program. Get that right. Start by getting that right, because there are too many people across this country waiting far too long to get care in emergency rooms for hours, in pain, waiting for a knee or a hip. And we, as premiers, have to address that issue head on, and we're prepared to do that, and we're doing our very best to do it. But without a relationship with Ottawa that is of some sustenance on an ongoing basis, we're not going to achieve the goals that Canadians deserve us to achieve. So that's my point. Don't start broadening healthcare when you can't get it right now. We need sustained funding. It is my hope that we can have solidarity in our time and achieve real change with these premiers. We've tried this before. This is a new opportunity, and I'm sincerely hopeful that we can maintain this coalition in favor of the best interests of Canadians around improving healthcare outcomes.
British Columbia has a comprehensive Pharmacare program already. We would welcome shared practices, shared best practices. We'd welcome dialogue with the federal government on standards across the country. These are important issues, but for us as a group today, we felt that the Canadian Health Transfer was more than just symbolic. It was meaningful to our budget so that we can deliver the health care that people need, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's care for seniors. The list is long. Wait times, diagnostic equipment, all of those issues are languishing while we have a discussion about taking us in a direction that many of us are already on. It wasn't a negative. I think I'm speaking for everyone when I say we were welcoming a discussion about a national Pharmacare plan, but those of us who already have significant plans would prefer that we first and foremost get back to a more equitable distribution of resources to deliver health care broadly across the piece.
When you look at the commitments of the federal government coming out of the last election, we discussed is about a $6 billion commitment over 4 years. That hits 3.5%. The ask at this table of 5.2% isn't a number that is plucked out of the air. It is a number that is necessary for us to sustainably fund what is a growing investment in jurisdictions across this province. So that is the gap that I think you're seeing this table ask for the federal government to consider closing. If they want to, in addition to that, look at a Pharmacare program across this nation and engage on provinces, and we have a very similar, what we view as a comprehensive program similar to British Columbia's. But if the federal government does want to engage on an additional effort on Pharmacare, that's fine. It needs to be fair for all Canadians, and it needs to be funded by the federal government.
In Quebec, we already have a Pharmacare program, so that's why I was happy that we all agreed to ask for an opting out clause to the federal government.
I think if you go across the country, there are varying degrees of what would be a Pharmacare program. Some would do a better job than others. But I think we all would agree that the federal government needs to play a larger role in the delivery of health care. So if the threshold is at 5.2% plus a Pharmacare program, wherever this goes, I'm not going to be ignoring any conversations about how we can benefit Canadians. We get a lot of stories of people that just cannot afford the prescription drugs. We also know that if you live in an aging province like Newfoundland and Labrador or all of Atlantic Canada and some other jurisdictions, that this will get more expensive. Drugs and diseases are becoming more complicated, more complex. The offerings of medications and others, pharmaceuticals, that can offer people more productive lives, is becoming more expensive. So we need to partner with the federal government. If indeed we go down this road, it has to be long-term. It has to be sustainable. The last thing we want to see is a program that comes in and it's eroded. Currently in our province right now, less than 20% of health care is provided by the federal government, and it's Newfoundlanders and Labradorians that are left to pay for the remaining 80%. So whatever the commitment is, it has to be long-term. It has to be the responsibility of the federal government. But I do believe that no matter where I go, Canadians want to entertain and want us to explore the options around a national Pharmacare program, but they also want to know and they want to see the federal government play a larger role in the overall delivery of health care. I would say this, we could put a big focus on wait times, and we could reduce our wait times. But if when they leave that physician's office or leave that health practitioner's office and they need medication, if they can't afford it then, what is the point of reducing the wait list if when they leave the physician or the healthcare practitioner, they can't afford the drugs that's prescribed to them?
Travis Standridge, Global News. This is a question for...
Mr. Kenny, I wanted to hear from you. En français, si vous voulez.
Oui, la position de l'Alberta est exactement la même du Québec.
Merci.
Travis Standridge, Global News. There have been calls for national unity from many of you after what was clearly a very divisive election. However, in what is now a pretty famous cover of Maclean's from last year, several of you appeared on the cover of that with the title The Resistance. Premier Kenney, Moe, Pallister, and Ford, do you still consider yourselves part of the resistance, and how do you square that imagery of division with the message of national unity?
Well, I'll take the first stab at that. That wasn't my word. I don't think it was the word of any of my colleagues, but to Maclean's magazine. I was elected with an historic mandate, in part to repeal the carbon tax in Alberta and to fight the threatened imposition of a federal carbon tax. We are continuing to do that. We gave Albertans the largest tax cut in our history, $1.6 billion, by scrapping a tax that was doing nothing to help the environment but was making life more expensive for ordinary people to heat their homes and drive to work. And so I believe we made exactly the right call. At the same time, we've brought in our technology innovation and emissions reduction program, which includes a levy on major industrial emitters that will significantly reduce CO2 emissions in our economy and help to develop green technology that reduces CO2 emissions in the future. Also equipment and technology that we can export to the developing world, to places like China and India where we see huge increases in CO2 emissions. So I think we struck the right balance. We've also, we're going to be going before the Alberta Appeals Court to seek a judicial reference on the constitutionality of the federal carbon tax. We think of the one that if that court looks at our very strong levy on major industrial emitters, they'll say that we're doing our job and the federal government doesn't need to double up and punish people for heating their homes. That's our position. Other provinces are going to take different positions. We respect that. I think we're synced up with two or three, at least 2 or 3 other provinces on this. I think we can do good for the environment without punishing people for heating their homes. That's the position of Alberta.
That cover speaks to the power of Photoshop. But if the federal government will listen to the unified voices of premiers from across this beautiful country on economic competitiveness, take steps to make the improvements that we've recommended, if they will move on the fiscal stabilization program, if they will move on sustainable funding for healthcare, they can lessen the resistance remarkably.
Well, again, none of us knew that was going to be on the front page, or none of us would have even taken the picture. But in saying that, Travis, I think this alone, right today, sends a very clear message to people back in their home provinces, sends a message to people right across this nation, and along with the federal government and the world, that we may have our differences, but Canada is united. We're a united nation. And as you've seen in this meeting, when some of the provinces are struggling, we're all there. We're going to be there. We support them. We have their back. And we're going to do everything we can to get them back on their feet. Because it wasn't too long ago. It wasn't too long ago that Ontario was taking equalization. We saw a pretty drastic recession back in, I believe, 2008, 2009. But we're here to send a message of certainty right across the world and across this nation. And people expect us to work together. You see every political stripe at this table. And we get along incredibly well, supporting each other. We saw it today. We saw it here with the 4 areas that we're concerned about. And we'll always support each other.
I was in Regina for that particular photo, and I would just put forward this. What you're seeing today, as opposed to any type of resistance, is a consensus of leaders from coast to coast to coast in this nation. A consensus when it comes to the fact that they want to be involved and consulted with and work closely with the federal government when it comes to regulation and policies and legislation that is going to have an impact on our industries that are creating wealth, not only in our respective jurisdictions, but our industries that are creating wealth by extension for all Canadians. And I speak in each of our jurisdictions. We all have industries like that that are already operating among the most, in many cases, among the most sustainable in their industry in the world. We are manufacturing jets and vehicles in this nation as sustainably as anywhere is in the world. We have some of the most sustainable energy products, whether it be oil or whether it be uranium. The most sustainable agri-food products come out of the nation of Canada. Just yesterday, you saw 3 provinces moving forward with an announcement on small modular reactors, with an intent in Saskatchewan's case to ultimately push our emissions down to eliminate our emissions in the electrical generation sector by 2050. So the leadership that we see at this table here today has come together on a consensus basis, had the discussion around being involved in environmental impact assessments that can have an impact on those already sustainable industries. To reiterate some of what we discussed in Saskatoon with respect to climate policy being in the provincial jurisdiction. Climate policy is in the provincial jurisdiction, so for good reason, so that we can address it in exactly the way we were addressing it with a memorandum of understanding and ultimate investment yesterday in zero emissions nuclear power. And as well, you saw today a consensus of leaders across this nation coming together to ask for and call for changes to the fiscal stabilization program to benefit not only a few provinces here today that have had a sudden downturn in their economic fortunes or in their GDP growth, but to also restructure that program so that it can support and invest in provinces into the future that may be experiencing something similar.
Just as a follow-up on what has been a divisive issue for many people in this country, Bill 21, I'm wondering if each of you could clarify your position on it, whether or not you condemn Bill 21, and if you think the Prime Minister should step in. We could start with.
Well, I'll jump in here. You know, we're here to talk about common ground. We could talk about things, Travis, that we don't agree with, but we're here to talk about common ground, and we respect the decisions that each province makes within their province, and I think I've answered that, so I'll leave it at that.
Does no one want to weigh in on that issue?
Agreed.
Okay. Brian Lilly, Toronto Sun. There are 2 premiers at this table, Mr. Legault and Mr. Horgan, who definitely don't want pipelines, 2 that definitely do. I'd like the 4 of you to tell me what you think this phrase in the communique means. Continuing to develop resources in a responsible manner and ensure access to markets for Canada's products. To me, that sounds like you're all in agreement. There should be pipelines to Tidewater. I'd be surprised if that's how you all view it, so I'd like to hear from you.
Well, firstly, I want to say I wore a blue suit today, so maybe McLean's will Photoshop me in too. Don't pay no attention to the orange polka dots on the tie. But on the question of corridors to get resources to market, there is a pipeline today that travels from Alberta to the heart of British Columbia's metropolitan area, Vancouver, and it has been there since 1953. There is a proposal to twin that pipeline. It has been approved by the appropriate regulatory body. It has been challenged multiple times at the appropriate levels of court and has been proven out. I believe that there is more work that can and should be done. We have a reference case currently before the Supreme Court, likely to be heard in the new year, with respect to what role the province has in regulating activity, not just of diluted bitumen, but any other product transported through British Columbia by rail, by pipeline, by carrier pigeon. What role does the province have to play? These are legitimate questions to ask in a federation, and that's what we're doing. With respect to the challenges in Alberta, they're profound, and I've made that abundantly clear, not just to Premier Kenney, but to former Premier Notley and to Prime Minister Trudeau. British Columbia stands resolute in our defense of the issues that matter to British Columbians, but we also recognize and understand that in a federation where there is an existing pipeline in place, we need to make practical changes to how we operate, and that's what we've been trying to do. With respect to Line 3, which just opened up, that's an opportunity for, I think you said 100,000 barrels of Alberta oil to get to market. We have a natural gas pipeline being built right now in British Columbia, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history, to move natural gas from Western Canada to other markets. And we're doing that within the context of a climate action plan that is unparalleled. So I believe we can do all of these things together, but if we don't sit down periodically, as we've done today, and come to unanimous positions on how we can mutually benefit each other, then we're going to continue to be frustrated and fractured. I believe the better way forward is to always have the opportunity to talk and find a way forward, and that's what we've done today. That's what we did in Saskatoon, and that's what we're going to do again, I'm hopeful, with the Prime Minister in the new year, and then on to Quebec City, where we're going to get a Nordique jersey, I hope.
The only thing I can add is that you know our positions on pipelines, and we haven't discussed this subject.
Next question. Premiers Moe or Kenny? How do you interpret that line in the communique?
Well, I interpret it as plain English, ou le français simple, which is to say that we support getting Canadian resources to markets. And I have reminded the federal government and my colleagues in the past that the Canadian Constitution, Section 92(10)(c), is absolutely clear that interprovincial pipelines are the exclusive jurisdiction of the national government, the federal government, and they have approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. John's right. This has been obviously subject to a lot of legal harassment by large intervention, he says, by largely U.S.-funded special interests, and they have lost at every step of the way. There are 2,000 people working on the pipeline now. Canadians in the public opinion polls support it by a margin of 2-1. And we are confident it's going to happen, and it will benefit all Canadians in terms of enormous wealth. Look, Canada has the amazing fortune of owning nearly 180 billion barrels of proven and probable reserves of crude, which have a notional market value today of over $10 trillion. When we talk about Pharmacare, healthcare, northern infrastructure, all of the social challenges we're dealing with, the rest of the world would do anything to have those kinds of resources. And our view is either we get those resources to market or we abandon global energy markets to the Saudis and the OPEC dictatorships and Vladimir Putin's Russia, with lower environmental standards and no human rights or labor standards. I think as long as the world needs that kind of energy, we have a responsibility to shrink the environmental impact of its development, to get it to market safely, so that we can compete with and displace OPEC dictator oil that fuels conflict, violence, and the suppression of human rights around the world. So I believe there is a compelling economic and moral argument for that. I believe the majority of Canadians understand that. And at the very least, I want to say that we are working with Francois and John and their governments on the prospect of exporting Canadian liquefied natural gas to the rest of the world through our west and east coasts to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by displacing high-emitting coal with low-emitting Canadian natural gas.
And I agree. Today, what we discussed were points where we were able to come agreement on. You've obviously picked up one point where there is some discrepancies at the table here. But I do agree with Jason with the disruption in some of our rail service over the course of the past few weeks started to have an impact on many of us here at this table. In different ways. So we need to continually, as John says, come to the table, have the conversation on how we can continue to work together to a better goal. Part of that is having a reliable process in place. Part of that, I would say, was discussed much more indirectly than just on pipelines today around the environmental impact assessment and how we can ensure that we have a competent process in place here in this nation to attract investment and track that investment security into our regions across Canada.
Next question.
Dylan Robertson with the Winnipeg Free Press. A question for Premier Moe. The Child Welfare Reform Bill C-92 wasn't part of the communique. I'm curious if you're disappointed you weren't able to reach a consensus on that and the outstanding questions around the reform.
No, we had a discussion with respect to C92 last evening, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And we had a good discussion with respect to C92 and how we were going to work collaboratively, not only with the organizations as it is here, but again, attempting to work with our federal government on exactly how this bill, noble in its intentions, and I think most would, if not all, would agree with that, how it is actually going to work where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And so we continue to work on Bill C-92 across jurisdictions, but also with individuals and groups, both First Nations communities, but also groups within those First Nations communities on exactly how this is going to function as that transition takes place.
I'm just going to jump in on that one and say for Alberta, we would ask the federal government to, and we have asked them to delay the implementation of C-92. It's set to come in on Jan 1, but we don't see that anybody's ready to implement a totally new system for Indigenous child welfare. The bill proposes to create a whole new level of Indigenous government bodies that do not currently exist, with no funding from the federal government in areas of provincial jurisdiction. In Alberta, a number of our First Nations communities are not in favor of this, or they have many questions about it. And what we cannot do is let kids fall between the cracks. So we would say let's get this right. Let's not rush into a system that is not yet in place just 5 weeks from now.
Next question, mic number 2.
A
and
question.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Question for Premier Kenny. You're talking about this today, Canada getting credit for liquid natural gas exports displacing coal in places like China. I know that's part of the Paris Agreement. I think it's Article 6, and that's being negotiated right now over in Madrid. A lot of experts are saying that that's not really how it works. And so I'm wondering why you keep making that argument that Canada would get these credits.
Well, let me dive in on that one first. I think it's to both of us. Well, it is now. We believe that low-emission natural gas is a preferable fuel source to high-emission thermal coal. And that has been discussed at Paris. It's being discussed again at the most recent COP. And I think that it does not happen today. We don't tote those emissions today, but we don't account for maritime emissions at all. And so we've got ships moving back and forth around the world, moving goods and services, many Canadian goods and services, without any accounting whatsoever. We have a lot of work to do on coming to terms with how we manage global emissions. And Canada's role, I believe, and certainly Western Canada's role in that, can be to displace these more noxious energy sources with a cleaner product, which was what we intend to do with natural gas coming out of British Columbia and the Montney Basin, which stretches into Alberta.
And, look, there's just absolutely no doubt that there's a huge, huge demand in places like China and India for natural gas. And guess what? The Americans are selling it. Americans have set up a whole huge industry on the Gulf Coast to ship it through the Panama Canal, which it's like 2 weeks longer sailing time to get to Chinese ports from where it would be off our west coast. This makes no sense. We talk about emissions from shipping. We can have a direct shot to those huge Asian markets. You know, I first met Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, when he was State Minister for Gujarat about a decade ago. First thing he wanted to know is when could he get Canadian liquefied natural gas to shift from coal-fired power, not only to reduce CO2 emissions, but also to stop NOx and SOx and particulate from poisoning the actual air quality for people in those countries. So this is something we can do to create good blue-collar jobs in Canada and reduce, improve global air quality and significantly reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And we absolutely, our council talked about this in Saskatoon in the summer, and our communique did call upon the federal government to use Article 6 in this respect. The feds deserve credit for having helped to negotiate Article 6 to give countries like Canada credit for when we export technology and other ways of reducing global emissions. But listen, the climate challenge is not like Canada does not live under a hermetically sealed biodome or something. We shouldn't just look at our economy and our environment in isolation. We've got to look at how we interact with the rest of the world, and LNG is one very positive way of doing so.
But is it
I would just add to that, Saskatchewan is having the same conversation with respect to our uranium exports. And if they're not sourcing the good, clean uranium fuel, the nuclear fuel from Saskatchewan, they're accessing it from other areas of the world, again with lower environmental standards in places like Kazakhstan. Same holds true for fertilizer products. The cleanest fertilizer that you can purchase in the world comes from Canada, comes from the province of Saskatchewan. And if you aren't purchasing your next boatload of fertilizer from Saskatchewan, you're quite likely purchasing it from a place like Russia, again, with lower environmental standards and a larger impact on the environment. Jason mentioned innovation and technology and Article 6 of the Paris Accord. Here is our opportunity as Canadians to lead. With the innovation and technology that we have in our industries that rank among the most sustainable in the world, as we share that innovation and technology through commerce, through Article 6 of the Paris Accord, we have an opportunity to make an impact far beyond the borders of this nation, far beyond the economic reach of the Canadian GDP. We have an opportunity to actually address what is a very global challenge, and to do it in the way that Canadians always do. Brian?
I would just add, for those who are thinking environmental assessment processes with an ongoing, time-consuming, costly, forever and a day type of nature to them, that are thinking, well, that's great because that solves my problem of getting oil and gas to market and I'm doing a good thing for the world. I just ask them to remember that you're not, because what you're doing is you're also creating onerous challenges for green mitigation, climate mitigation projects, flood protection, hydroelectric projects like Manitoba's trying to engage in, with perpetual challenges put in front of them, because this is the environmental assessment process we have in our country right now. We can't build things, not just pipelines. We can't build energy corridors with green hydroelectric power either. That's why this is a priority for these premiers. And we are consistent in saying we need to be able to get goods to market, products to market, including clean, green energy. We need to be able to protect our people against the effects of climate change, such as flooding, additional flooding, which is happening around the country on a regular basis. So we need a process that allows us to protect our own people and help green up the world at the same time, and I think we can get to that, and these premiers are unanimous in believing that.
But can I just ask on the credits, why should Canada get credits for this? It almost sounds like you're saying that if we help people pollute less, we can pollute more.
Well, I disagree with you. I mean, if we can get a Minnesota-Manitoba power line that gets green energy down to Minnesota so they can get off coal-produced power, that's a good thing. If we can get that line into our neighboring provinces and help them do that, that's a good thing. If we can get that hydro project done, we also help the people of Wisconsin get off dirtier power. Okay, so we're in this together. And we need to understand that climate change doesn't know boundaries and borders. So we need a federal government that will work with us as a partner to make the processes more reasonable, more balanced, always consultative, but with an outcome, not just a perpetual half-life that involves consulting until the world just keeps heating up in the absence of the projects we'd like to build together.
Premier Kenny, can I just get you to respond to that?
I reject the premise of the question. The bottom line is every extra unit of exported Canadian liquefied natural gas will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. That is a concrete thing. We could shut down the Canadian economy completely tomorrow, and the growth in emissions from China and India alone would make up for that in just a few years. So that's not to say we shouldn't continue to reduce emissions at home or try to. It is to say the global game changer on greenhouse gas emissions that Canada can play in the foreseeable future is significantly increasing our LNG exports, and I think we're pretty much united on that.
Premier Higgs?
I would like to comment on that as well, because we continue to look at Canada in a bubble. And the opportunity we have is to once again regain our world kind of dominance in energy supply and energy being a world influencer. And we have the only LNG plant in Canada in New Brunswick. And if you think about how the economy changes, just let's say 10 years ago, it was built to bring in LNG and to supply gas into the North American market. And within a few years of it being built, all of a sudden there's all kinds of gas in the North America. And we now have that opportunity to export that. If we keep thinking of ourselves in a bubble and we don't utilize the resources we have right now to make a global difference, then we're missing a huge opportunity to be that world leader once again. And I feel that in Canada, in New Brunswick, I mean, we have an issue trying to have our own resources to develop them in the natural gas sector, but I'm pushing forward with that. But people think that's old technology. This is a game changer in allowing a global emission reduction that actually makes a difference in the world. What we signed yesterday with my colleagues in Ontario and Saskatchewan, it's a game changer in zero emissions, in a whole new technology that is not utilized, doesn't exist today. So if we don't look at that, the small portion of our energy consumption in this world that is actually supplied by wind or solar or renewables will never sustain us globally. It will continue to go well beyond what our demands are. So we have that need right now to develop technology that will put Canada back on the world stage where it belongs as a global emission reduction leader.
Thank you, Premiers. That's all the time we have for questions today. I'll ask.
Un instant, vous allez prendre des questions en français.
Sorry, that's all the time. We have a 45-minute cap. Yep, family picture here. Thank you, Premiers.
Why don't the 6 of us stay seated and the other 6 behind us?
Which 6? Who are the 6? Yeah.